Um, Hello everyone. This lecture is going to be focused on another type of the loop, which is the while loop. So let's discuss that theoretically first. Let's look at a few features which are important for execution, and then we are going to practically apply it in the PyCharm, having set an example of how we can use this kind of loop efficiently to in order to execute our code, or let's say find a solution to a problem. So let me open up a whiteboard. All right, so as of now we know that there are two types of loops. um, the main categories which were discussed in the previous lecture as well. One is the counter controlled, in which you have only one type, which is the for loop. And the other one is basically the conditional loop, in which you have two types. One is the precondition and one is the postcondition. Now, if we talk about the precondition, in which a certain condition is basically met, or if it is true, the instructions or your lines of codes are basically run. That is basically where we have the while loop. The pseudocode text is basically the while, do, and end while. So technically it's uh, the while loop. And in the post condition, we have the repeat until, right? So I've mentioned this earlier as well, that when we are programming in Python, we do not have the post condition or the repeat until. The main difference between the two is that in while loop, first the condition is basically met. If it is true, the instructions are processed. Once the condition is set false, the loop does not run. And in the repeat until, the instructions are basically being put in, and then it is being tested against a particular criteria or a condition. So the main difference between the two is, in the while, the condition is first checked and then the instructions are processed. In the repeat loop, the instructions are being processed at least once and then they are checked against a condition. So Python does not allow you to have a loop in which the condition is basically checked later on, in which we can say that the repeat until group does not exist in Python. Now, let's talk about the basic syntax that we are to use, and then we are going to talk about a few features or the few things that we need to make sure that whenever we are to execute a while loop in Python, what we need to consider. Now, the basic syntax is very simple. You just put in while, which is not in all caps, while, and then your condition will come. So over here, your condition will come. And then instead of do, which you write in the pseudocode, you will put a colon. Now this is actually representing or replace do with a colon. Then you're going to press enter and it will be inside the loop over here. So you're going to write your instruction 1, you're going to write your instruction 2, then instruction 3. And after you're done, you are not to write and while, right? So in the pseudocode, you do write and while, but in Python, you don't. So you don't have to end the loop by writing or typing in end while right underneath the while, you just come out of the indentation, just like what you do in the selection, in which you do not write the end if, and similarly for the for loop, you don't get to write end for. So similarly in the while, you don't have to write end while. So this is basically it. This is what you all have to do. Now, if you are to consider the pointers or the features that you are to consider when we are talking about the while loop, right? So the very first point, which is to be kept in mind, is that while loop is what? It's is preconditional, right? Second point that needs to be kept in mind, that while loop will keep on running till the condition that you set is true. Now, I will also explain what the condition is when we, solve a particular example using PyCharm. But yes, keep this in mind. It will keep on running till the condition is true. So when the condition is false, it will stop running. Point number three. Now, since it has to, meet a condition and then process the instructions. So for instance, if you are to run your instructions for 5 times, right? So if you are to run the instruction set 5 times, you need to make sure that that the condition remains true for 5 times. It's actually reiteration of the same point that I've written, that since the while loop is going to run till the condition is true, so again, you just need to identify how many times you want to run, and that for that many times you need to make sure that the condition is basically true. So coming down to the fourth point, it is just like the selection statements, that is if and the counter controlled loop, that is for while loop is also dependent on indentation, right? So it is basically dependent on the indentation. The moment you want to end, you don't have to write end while, you just come out of the indentation. Point number 5, which needs to be kept in mind, is that the number of times you wish to run the while loop you are to initiate a counter before your loop, before your loop, right? So I will just demonstrate a few um, programming instructions, or let's say a code set for a similar scenario, and then we'll look at it, that whether we are able to run, or whether we are able, how we are basically controlling the while loop as well. Always keep this in mind, that in order to find the solution to a problem, there can be multiple ways. You can do it manually, you can do it through if, you can do it through for loop, you can do it through while loop. There are only the few things that you need to keep in mind. If you are to do a process through the for loop, there are certain prerequisites. If you are to do it the same scenario with the while loop, certain prerequisites. And similarly, it can be done manually, it can be done through the if statements, or let's say the selection statements as well. Now let's consider an example and see how it is basically dealt, and how efficient can a while loop be in a particular scenario. Yes, the scenarios may change, but the crux, or basically the main idea of applying the while loop, will remain the same. So let's open up PyCharm and try to understand, and let's see how it actually works. So let's say um, for an example, I would say that, okay, we are to add 5 numbers and display its total, or yes, say it's going to be an addition of 5 numbers, while taking the input from the user. All right, so I will do this, or I will address this scenario using the manual method. Now, the first thing, that if I have to take the input, I will just type in input, bracket open, close. I put in the message, okay, type in, yeah, please input your number, let's say your first number, right? So this will take an input, and with a message which is please input your first number. If I press shift F10, you can see that I do get an output, which is actually taking an input from the user. So let's say I put in the value as 10, press enter, the code ends. Okay, now if I want to print that value, right, if I have to take an output of that value, so I will type in print. But what do I need to print? I need to print my input, where the input is basically what type? Integer. So let's say I will type in integer, and I will put this whole input as an integer type. Still, I cannot take the output. Why? Because this is not being assigned to a variable. So we know that we can assign this whole thing as a variable. So I would say this is my num sum, right? And equals to. So this value, which is going to be an input as an integer, is going to be assigned to the num sum, and this is basically going to print the num sum, which is the name of my variable. Okay, so again, shift F10, you can see I can take the first input, which is 10. When I press enter, it takes the value, it displays the value, which is okay. Now I need to add 5 numbers. So I'm going to take this whole statement, copy it. 1, this is my second number, third number, fourth, fifth. Now I'm going to make a few changes. So let's say this is my number 1, number 2, number 3, 4, 5, So input my first number, input my second number, third, fourth, and fifth. Okay, so I have introduced 5 variables, named them as num1 till num5. All these variables are going to take an input from the user, and then I need to take a print. Now the num sum is basically no more there, so I would have to take out the sum of this. So I can write num1 plus num2 plus num3 plus num4 plus num5. Shift F10 to run this code. The first number is 10, second number is 20, third number is 30, fourth number is 40, last number is 50, and you can see I get the value which is 150. Okay, this is one way of doing it. We can also assign, let's say I'm going to assign this variable as total sum, which is basically num1 plus num2 plus num3 plus num4 plus num5. Okay, and instead of the operation in the output, I will just type in total sum. So it will perform the same. Shift F10. The first number 10, second 20, third 30, 40, 50. You get the answer. I can even incorporate this or concatenate this particular output with a custom message. So in my print, I would say that, okay, the total of 5 numbers using the manual method is colon space speech marks, and then I'm going to concatenate this value of total sum with my message. So now again, shift F10, the first number is 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and then you get the message. The total of 5 numbers using the manual method is 150. So this is one way of doing it. Then we talked about that, okay, this process seems to be tedious, because what if I have to take the numbers to or take a total of, let's say, 500 numbers or 500,000 numbers. So this is not the appropriate way of doing it. This is not the most efficient way of doing it. However, yes, it can be done, but not the efficient way. So we introduced, or we talked about that, okay, addition, or we'll just copy the same statement. So copy it and let's say paste it over here from the user using the for loop. Now, in the for loop, the syntax basically sets the number of times the instructions are going to run, right? And for that, we know we do use the command for I in range. And then in the brackets, we are to set our lower boundary and the upper boundary. So let's say the lower boundary is 0. And since it has to run till, or let's say taken 5 numbers, the upper boundary I have to set, which is not going to be inclusive of the process. So I will put in, let's say, 5 over here. So the index value, which is I in this case, the index value is going to start from 0, then 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. The 5, which is being set as my upper boundary, is not going to be selected, or it's not going to be a part of the process. So it will come down up until 4. The index value is going to go up until 4. And then we put a colon. So we can just type in print, let's say, in order to test this, and we can type in hello. So it will come here and it will run 5 times. It will print what? This instruction, which is the word hello. So this is how you initiate the for loop. If I just demonstrate what the code does, so 10, 20, this is basically the first instruction set, the manual one, which is running. So we're just going to add the same numbers. Now, right after when I press enter, this was the total resulting of this line number 9. And then you can see the loop automatically ran. It ran for 5 times. We can see the print of hello appearing 5 times. Now, in order to find the addition, for the for loop, I need to initiate total for. Let's say that's a variable, and I need to set the value to be 0. I don't have to set the counter for this. Why? Because in the for loop, it is counter controlled. We already set the count when we initiate the loop. So the count is actually set with the range, and I is basically being referred to as the index, which is going to increment automatically. We don't have to increment the counter ourselves. It is going to be incremented because in the for loop, this is going to be set by the range. Okay. Now, what do I need to add as my instruction, which is going to be run, which is going to run for 5 times? This is actually the number input, right? So I would say I'll just take this whole thing and copy it, and instead of the output I will be pasting this. Now it does not have to be num1, I would say num4, right? Now just like the print command which executed 5 times, now this statement, which is going to take an input from the user, is going to run 5 times, right? And then what do I need to do? I need to take my input, whatever the input is, and assign it, or let's say add it to my total. Please note that the total is initiated outside my loop. Now for that, I am going to use total for plus equals to the num4. So that will do what? This statement is actually equivalent to what? It is actually equivalent to total for equals to total for plus num4, which means what? Which means the previous value of the total for is to be added with the current, or let's say the recent value being added for the num4, or the value which has being put in by the user. And then what do I need to do? I need to take a print. So in the next line, if I start typing in print, and let's say if I want the print of my total, which is actually total for, if I do this, what will it do? Let's find out first. Shift F10, first number, again, the first code block is going to run. So 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. And then the for loop started, first number 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. So as you can see, whenever I was giving the computer the input of my number, it was adding it to my total, and it was also printing it, because the print command is actually within the loop. However, if I want the total to be displayed at the end, right after I input my numbers, this print needs to be outside my loop, so over here, so indented backward to the main line. So now if I run this, again the first code block 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. This is my total, which is the total of 5 numbers using the manual method is 150. Now the for loop 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. And then as you can see, it is 150. So I can take the same custom message and concatenate this with my total for using for loop is. All right, so this is how we can do the same process using the for loop. Executing again, just to show you that the custom message appears the way we want. Now the for loop 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50. So you can see the total of 5 numbers using for loop is 150 as well. Now same scenario using the while loop. So I will just take this line, copy it, paste it here, and this is now using the while loop. Now there's a difference between the while and the for loop. In the for loop, the counter automatically increments, but in the while loop, you are to control the counter. How many times you are to run it, you are to specify it. Okay, I mean, you need to initiate the counter yourself, which means I would say that, okay, count, or it can be a counter, count while is set to 0, and also the total. So total while is also set to 0. Two variables initiated, and both of them are being set with the value 0. So our final total is 0 as yet, and the loop, which is going to start from 0, is also at the first index value, which is 0 in this case. So the counter is being introduced by ourselves. In the for, you can see that there was no counter involved. Now we just straight away write our condition, which is while what? While the counter. Now what's the counter? The counter is count while the counter is set to be. Now I need to identify how many times I need to run this. Okay, so if it is starting from 0, again the same process applies. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. That is equivalent to 5 times. So while my counter, or let's say while my condition is true, the instructions are going to be processed. So I need to be very careful when I'm inputting the condition. Let's say if I say that while count while is greater than 4, right? Because we are to consider 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So if I write this condition, what does that mean? That means that while the count while is going to be greater than 4, then do the instructions. This is wrong. We need to make the condition true in order to run the instructions. So you need to be careful when you're setting your condition. My loop will run when the count while remains what? It remains up until 4. So I can type in either less than or equals to 4, or I can set it to less than 5. That also means the same. After I set my condition, rather than typing in do, or let's say pressing enter, I need to put in colon. Then when we press enter, we are inside the loop. What do we have to do? When we are running the loop, it has to take an input. The input is basically the number. So we'll take the same instruction which we had in the for loop, and we are going to paste it here. And instead of num4, I'm going to name this as num while. So it is going to take the input of an integer, the first number. Let's change this to not the first number. Please input your number. So please input your number. Okay. Once this is done, obviously this total needs to be added to the number which we add needs to be added to the total. So we are going to take the same statement which we used over here, same technique over here as well. We are to add the total while this is also going to be while, and this is basically num while. So up until this instruction, the process is the same. However, in the for loop, the counter increments itself, but in the while loop, the counter needs to be incremented by you. So the next instruction which needs to be added to your while loop is going to be count while equals to count while plus 1. So you need to increment the counter. And then are we going to print the answer over here, which is the total while? No, we are to print the answer as one entity, which is going to be outside our loop. So over here, if we are to run this code, this is the first number, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. So this is the manual method. We get 150. Now we are in the for instruction set. So first number, second number, third number, fourth number, fifth number. So the total of 5 numbers using the for loop is 150. Now we are using the while instruction set. So the first number, second number, third number, fourth number, fifth number. Answer 150. Again, I can have the custom message. I will just take this text, paste it here, concatenate it, edit this message to, let's say, while, right? And we can run this. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and then 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. So you can see the total of 5 numbers using the while loop is also 150. Same scenario dealt differently, manually, for loop, while loop. One more thing that I would want to add before I end this is look at the assignment of, or let's say the totaling of. This statement can also be written like plus equals to. Over here, this can also be written as plus equals to num while. The incremental value can also be written as plus equals to 1. It will perform the same thing. It will have no impact whatsoever on your result. 40, 50, then we have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. We have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. So you can see the code runs manually, the code runs with the for loop, and the code runs with the while loop. Main difference, loop, for loop, it runs for the number of times you specify in your starting statement. There are no footer statements in here as well. It is also not dependent on any end or footer statements like next, or let's say for next or whatever. So it is only dependent on the indentation. Same goes for the while loop. The condition is to be compared. If it is true, it will run the instructions. Once the condition is false, it will stop running. It is also dependent on the indentation. You will have to introduce the counter variable. You will have to set it to 0. This is the same technique that you use while writing a pseudocode. While writing a pseudocode for the while loop, you are to initiate the counter from 0 or 1, whatever. And then you have to test your counter, which is actually going to act as your index value. And comparison of that, if it is true, you go through the process. Now, this was a very simple example to execute the whole thing, but keep this in mind that the loops can also contain selection statements in them. They can also contain more loops in them, which is called a nested loop. So all depends on the scenario. I hope you were able to grasp the concept of a while loop, and I've given you a comparison with the manual and the for loop. So I expect, or I hope, that you are able to understand and apply this. Do practice it. If there are any questions, do let me know. And I will also try to share a few practice assignments with you for the for loop and the while loop. You already have those as well. You can try them, try the scenarios which were not doable earlier. But if you have understood this, you should be able to do both the assignments using the if statements manually, for loop, or the while loop. Now, it depends on the programmer how they approach the situation or how they want to pursue the solution to the problem. That is it for now. This was the while loop in Python. Thank you very much.